Okay, everybody, this is a video to give you a little bit more information and teach you a little bit about yarn when you're ready to do an actual project. So yarn comes in lots of colors, shapes, designations. There's variegated, there's single color like this is. Some of it is a little more textured, some of it gets larger and smaller. For a beginning knitter, I would recommend that you stick with a fairly consistent shaped yarn. Acrylic is nice because it's easy to use, it's relatively inexpensive, it tends to be soft, you can wash it, but wools are nice too. So when you get yarn, what you're going to find is, besides the brand, most colors will have a lot number. If you're making a project with multiple skeins of yarn, you ideally would like to match the lot number so that the dye lots are the same in each yarn. Depends on what you're making, but it can come up as an issue. And then further down the label, you're going to see this box is for knitting and this box is for crocheting. And this gives you an idea of what the size of the needle that's recommended for this yarn. So this is a worsted weight yarn. A lot of times it will say that somewhere else. This one doesn't happen to say that. This skein is similar, worsted weight. Size 8 needle is generally what a worsted weight yarn is. And worsted is a nice, easy to use yarn. Good weight, not too heavy, very versatile. Most of the cheaper yarns that you can get from Walmart and Hobby Lobby or Michaels are primarily worsteds, but not all. But this is a suggestion. You can use whatever size needle you want. The next things you're going to want to know about is how much yardage or meterage you have for the yarn, because if your project needs a certain amount of yardage, let's say you decide you're making an afghan and it needs 1,000 yards, well, you're probably going to want around 3 skeins of this yarn. So this is called a skein. Yarn needles are designated as a millimeter, which is the diameter of the needle, or a size, and you'll see the USA size 8 and these UK size 6. We don't really care about the UK stuff because we're not in the UK, so we just pay attention to the size 8. Most of your needles are going to have something on the end of them somewhere. That one has it there. This one is written with a 9. This one is a 7. There are also gauges that you can get to run your yarn through. Yarn has 2 ends, right? The top end and the bottom end. Most knitters like to use the one that pulls from the center because the skein doesn't have to spin, and if your skein is spinning constantly, you can get your yarn to really wind up tight and sort of do that sort of thing. So on this skein, this was nicely designated, and the outside one is over here. You can pull back the label a little bit and you can see it's coming off of the outside. I usually just wind those up, tuck that in a little bit, slide the label back over it. Most of the time I knit off the skein. There are times when I will rewind into a ball, but most of the time I knit off the skein. So when you find your end of the yarn, you pull out enough to cast on, and this is the thing that's difficult. At least it was always difficult for me, and as a little girl I spent a lot of time having somebody else cast on my work. So when you're casting on, this yarn here, just to show you, doesn't have an end sticking out, so we have to kind of reach inside of the yarn and we pull out a blob. And in the knitting world we call this yarn barf. Comes out like that sometimes, and then I always check to see where is that actually coming from. So that one looks like it's coming from the inside, because sometimes it'll fool you and that end from the outside of the yarn is actually stuck in there and becomes part of the yarn barf, which can mess you up. So in this glob of yarn, somewhere is the end, and I'll just wrap it around the yarn and find the end and start with that. So there are knitters who use the outside of the skein. If you have a holder that can spin with you, then that's a little easier to use, but just wanted you to know about Yarn Barf, the samples that I started you on. Because I had knit. So here's my end, and I will just go through this quick and then rewind this back onto the skein so that it's not hanging out somewhere. All right, back to this. So I've got my length of yarn. Patterns will tell you to cast on a certain number. So it'll be like cast on 20, cast on 120, cast on 10. For our project, I've been casting on 15 onto the needle, and this is just for practice. When you're looking at a pattern, it's going to tell you a gauge, which is how many stitches and how many rows with a specific needle and what the measurements should be. So if you're knitting something that gauge matters, like a sweater, then you're going to want to test and use your gauge and see if your knitting is matching the gauge. And if it's not, you may need to use a bigger needle or a smaller needle to get your gauge into to match the measurements, because otherwise your sweater is not going to fit right. For something like a scarf, gauge isn't as important, so you don't necessarily have to do that swatch. So when I'm going to cast on, there's a lot of different ways to determine how many stitches, how much yarn you need. This is the long tail cast on. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I'm going to show you one way to estimate is to just wrap your yarn around however many times the stitches is, and that gives you an estimate of how much you need for that long tail side. So that would have been, I don't know, that was probably 10 stitches and then this much yarn. I'm just going to eyeball it because it's 15. I do tend to be kind of weird and get like I want it to come out at the exact amount that I want, but that's a little bit that's just me. All right, so you get your length of yarn that you want, and this is the working side and this is the skein side. You're going to create a slip knot, kind of right where those two sides meet. And to do that, you just wrap it around your fingers and you pull up the loose piece. So wrapping it around my fingers and pulling up the other side, and that's a slip knot. How do I know it's a slip knot? Because it can slip, see? Stick my needle in there, and now it's on the needle. You've got the working yarn, which is also the end. So this is the working yarn, and this is the yarn that goes to the skein. So for casting on, this is the designations. Now, the tricky part is you'll see they make kind of a little V with that slip knot on the needle. You're going to take your thumb and index finger and you're going to put them in between that V. So when you pick it up, your hand, they're now wrapped around your fingers like that. If you can imagine, there's a little, I'm going to try to loop right there, and that's what we're going to use to cast on. So this is how we get the loops on our needle originally. So you're going to go over to this thumb needle, you're going to go under, so you're going in through that kind of that hole. You can kind of see where my needle is in a hole there. Then I'm coming over to the index finger yarn and I'm going to pull that through. So I'll do that again. Got my slip knot. Put my fingers between the two sides. You want to make sure that your working side is on the index finger and the skein side is on the thumb, because the working yarn is what you're going to use up as you cast on. So in there again, pull my fingers back so I can see that thumb line. I'm going to go under the thumb needle and then under the index needle, or under yarn, sorry, under the thumb yarn, under the index yarn. And I've created a little bit of a loop. I pull that. Now you don't want to pull this so tight that you can't put a needle in there. And you don't want to have it be sloppy. So tension is important. You need to be consistent. So if you're a loose knitter, that's fine. You just choose needles and yarn to fit the gauge that you need that works with your style of knitting. So if you're a tight knitter, you may need to use bigger needles. I'm sort of on the little bit on the tight side in general. So that's 2 stitches now on my needle, 1, 2. So now I'm going to do it again. And pull that yarn down. Again, you want to make them about the same tension. I'm not letting go with this hand as I do this. I'm just going through and pulling those, but I'm keeping this held with my pinkies to keep the extra yarn out of my way, but still with some tension on it. So we'll keep going. You might need to slide it from time to time down your needle. If you're doing a very large project like an Afghan and they want you to cast on 120, I don't count as I go. I just cast on a whole bunch and then I count it. So how you count is up to you, but I count by 2s. 2, 4, 6, and that's 8 stitches. So 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So casting on is tedious. So let's count them together just so that we can reassure ourselves that we have our 15 stitches. You're better off to count multiple times and know you have the right number of stitches on your needle than it is to come to the end of something that has a little bit of a pattern to it and find out that you don't have enough needle stitches on there and need to pull it out. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. So that's the same as all the others. Now, these are fairly uniform and consistent. This is the working side of your yarn. If you look at the other side, it looks slightly different. It has these row of bumps on here, so this is the back side. So when you're actually going to knit, I don't have an extra spare needle here. You get to the end here, you're not going to be using this piece anymore. So this cast on line goes over there. You may use it to seam or something like that. Now you're going to be working with the skein side yarn. One of the way you can tell which way you're going, it's easier once you're off the first stitch, is the skein side needle is coming from where you've been. So we've been through these stitches, right? So when if I'm trying to figure out which way I'm going to need it to show that I'm going to go through these stitches. It's been through here. We want to go the other way. And so then we would do this. I'm just holding back this cast on line. Sometimes I will wind it up on my fingers like this and sort of slip knot it to get it out of my way. If I'm doing a project that needs to be seamed, it's nice to have that extra yarn. Sometimes you can get really precise and get the right amount, but you always want some tail here. Otherwise, the stitch is not a good stitch and it's hard to work with that stitch the first time around. So you do want some tail. This is now ready to start knitting. Let's say you found out that you cast it on and then you look at it and it's terrible, you don't like how it looks. So you don't have to cut it off and start over. You just pull it off your needle, pull gently on one side or the other, and it comes back to 0. And then I can easily pull this apart too and start. Or if I found out that I had, 6 feet extra, then I might designate a little bit. So let's do the slip knot again. It's just wrap it around your fingers, pull up that. Okay, now I've got a knot. Stick my needle in, tighten it down. Not super tight, it's a stitch. And then the fingers through, working yarn, skein yarn, under, pull. Under, pull. So now that's an example of different tension on my stitches. So then I might do one, oh, that was awful, right? So then we just keep going. So these are all different tension, and that's not going to be easy to work with. When you first knit, practicing and getting your tension right is really the most important thing you can do, because that's going to serve you for everything else that you do. Knit stitch and purl stitch are the basic stitches, but tension is so important in being consistent with your tension. Again, if you're a loose knitter, we can work with that. If you're a tight knitter, we can work with that. But being consistent is really the most important thing. So I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. Otherwise, this is your cast on video. You can practice casting on with your needles, and we will practice the knit stitch and the purl stitch, and then practicing knitting until you're comfortable with your tension and you're consistent before you start a pattern is really the best thing you can do. 12, 13, 14, 15, and I still got a fair amount there on that yarn. So this is called the long tail cast on. This is one method of casting on. There are many methods of casting on. This one is probably the easiest one. I use this probably for 90% of my projects. The edge is somewhat stretchy, but not overly stretchy. A couple things about acrylic yarn: there's not a lot of stretch to it when you really pull it tight. Wool yarn may have some stretch. The other thing is you'll see that it's actually twisted of multiple fibers. You want to be careful when you're inserting your needle that you're not getting just a piece of a fiber like that. So that's another thing. It's one of the reasons why it's good to practice on a light colored yarn so you can see all of your stitches. And a dark colored yarn like black is very difficult to see the stitches. So, all right, well, I'm available for questions if you need me. Thank you.